In just 6 days, armies clashed and borders vanished as Israel launched a secret dawn attack, shattering the Arab alliance and redrawing the Middle East overnight. With a single cabinet vote on June 4th, war became inevitable. Yet few predicted the scale of what would unfold. How did a diplomatic crisis trigger one of history's fastest and most transformative wars? The answer begins in the final hours before the first engines roared to life. Egyptian soldiers poured into the Sinai Peninsula, their convoys stretching for miles across the desert. On May 18, 1967, United Nations peacekeepers received orders to withdraw, leaving the buffer zone empty for the first time in a decade. Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt's charismatic president, addressed cheering crowds in Cairo, promising that Egyptian arms would defend Arab dignity. His speeches broadcast across the region echoed with defiance. The time had come, he declared, to confront Israel directly. Within days, Egyptian artillery and tanks took up positions along the Israeli border. On May 22, 1967, Nasser announced the closure of the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, severing Israel's vital maritime lifeline to Asia and oil supplies. Israeli leaders interpreted this as an existential threat. In Tel Aviv, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol and his cabinet weighed their options as the streets filled with anxious reservists and families bracing for war. Air raid shelters were prepared. Lines formed at grocery stores as rumours of invasion spread. Diplomatic channels flickered with last-minute appeals, but the atmosphere darkened. On May 30, 1967, King Hussein of Jordan arrived in Cairo and signed a mutual defence pact with Nasser. Syrian and Iraqi forces pledged support. Across Israel's borders, more than 250,000 Arab troops and nearly 2,000 tanks now stood ready. The sense of encirclement grew sharper with each passing hour. In the kibbutzim of the north, families slept in bunkers as Syrian shells crashed into fields. In the south, Bedouin herders watched unfamiliar columns of armour churn the sand. The world watched, but no one intervened. The countdown to war had begun. In the hours before dawn on June 5, 1967, Israel's National Unity Cabinet gathered behind closed doors. The debate was tense. Every voice weighed against the clock. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol hesitated, mindful of international pressure and the risk of total war. Defence Minister Moshe Dayan, newly appointed and bearing the scars of earlier battles, pressed for immediate action. Intelligence reports made the decision feel inescapable. Egyptian airfields were crowded with bombers and fighters, their runways exposed, their crews unprepared for a sudden blow. Shortly after midnight, the cabinet gave its formal authorization. Orders rippled out to air bases across the country. Pilots were briefed in silence, knowing that the fate of their families and their nation might rest on their flight paths. At 7:10 a.m., nearly 200 Israeli jets lifted off, hugging the Mediterranean and Red Sea at altitudes so low that radar screens in Cairo stayed blank. By 7:45 a.m., the first wave struck 11 Egyptian airfields. Specially designed munitions shattered runways, cratering the tarmac and trapping hundreds of planes on the ground. In minutes, anti-aircraft guns and radar stations fell silent under rocket and cannon fire. Within 2 hours, a second wave finished the job. By noon, over 300 Egyptian aircraft were burning wrecks, their wings twisted on blackened runways. The Egyptian Air Force, once the largest in the Arab world, had been crippled before it left the ground. Dayan watched the sortie logs with grim satisfaction. The sky above Israel was now clear, opening the way for ground forces to advance. Diplomacy had given way to the thunder of jet engines and the blinding flash of explosives on concrete. Israeli tanks surged into the Sinai as the sun climbed over the dunes, engines roaring through the sand. Commanded by General Ariel Sharon, the southern divisions raced toward the Egyptian lines, aiming for the heavily fortified Abu Agila complex. This strongpoint, ringed by minefields and dug-in artillery, anchored Egypt's entire eastern defence. Israeli engineers crawled forward under fire, clearing paths through the mines with explosive charges and bulldozers. As darkness fell, infantry and armour moved in tight coordination, weaving between burning wrecks and shattered bunkers. By dawn on June 6th, Abu Agila had fallen. The Egyptian line collapsed, leaving hundreds of tanks and trucks abandoned along the desert roads. Israeli columns pressed on, seizing key passes and driving toward the Suez Canal. With the capture of Sharm el-Sheikh, the blockade of the Red Sea was broken. For the first time in weeks, Israeli ships could reach the port of Eilat. In just 36 hours, the southern front had been transformed. The rapid advance across Sinai opened the way for further gains, reshaping the map and the balance of power in the region. Israeli forces turned their attention to the West Bank as artillery thundered across the hills surrounding Jerusalem. Paratroopers advanced through the labyrinth of narrow streets, pushing toward the city's ancient heart. The fighting was close, house to house, stone to stone, each step contested by Jordanian troops determined to hold their ground. In the early hours of June 7th, Israeli commanders gave the order to take the old city. Soldiers rushed through the Lion's Gate, boots echoing on worn flagstones as they pressed forward under sporadic sniper fire. The air was thick with dust and the crack of gunfire, but the Israeli advance proved unstoppable. By midday, the Temple Mount and Western Wall stood under Israeli control for the first time in nearly 2 millennia. The radio crackled with the words, "The Temple Mount is in our hands." For many, the moment was defined by a single image: 3 paratroopers standing in awe before the Western Wall, their faces marked by fatigue and disbelief. Across the West Bank, Israeli units swept through Hebron and Bethlehem, consolidating control as stunned residents watched convoys roll past. The battle for Jerusalem had ended, but the meaning of its capture would echo far beyond the city's ancient stones. Syrian artillery batteries dominated the northern frontier, their guns trained on the Israeli villages below. For years, the Golan Heights had offered a perch for relentless shelling, turning daily life in Galilee into a waiting game for the next explosion. On June 9th, Israeli commanders ordered a direct assault on the heights. Infantry units began the climb at first light, advancing uphill through tangled minefields and fortified Syrian bunkers. The ground was rocky, the air thick with dust and the roar of artillery. Every step forward came under machine gun fire, but the Israeli brigades pressed on, determined to silence the threat looming over their homes. The fighting was brutal and close. Engineers cleared paths under fire, while tanks manoeuvred along narrow tracks, sometimes stalling on the steep slopes. By the next morning, the first strong points had fallen. Syrian resistance was fierce, but by midday on June 10th, Israeli troops reached the plateau. The last Syrian guns fell silent at noon, ending years of bombardment on the valley below. As word of a ceasefire spread, the guns that had haunted northern Israel stood abandoned. The final shots of the war echoed over the Golan, marking both a tactical victory and the end of 6 days of relentless combat. Ceasefire lines froze the new reality in place. Israel now held the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip, wrested from Egypt. The West Bank and East Jerusalem were under Israeli control, taken from Jordan. To the north, the Golan Heights, long a source of shellfire, had been seized from Syria. In 6 days, Israel's territory had nearly tripled, stretching from the Suez Canal to the banks of the Jordan River and up to the cliffs above the Galilee. The familiar map of the Middle East was redrawn almost overnight, with frontiers pushed outward on every mile. Nearly 300,000 Palestinians left their homes in the West Bank and Gaza in the weeks that followed the fighting. UNRWA field teams, working under chaotic conditions, registered families as they crossed into Jordan or sought shelter in makeshift camps. Streets once crowded with daily life now stood emptied, and schools and clinics were overwhelmed by the sudden tide of people. Displacement was immediate and total. The number of dead remains bitterly contested. Arab sources cite more than 15,000 killed, while Israeli counts are far lower, with fewer than 1,000 Israeli deaths. Behind every statistic stood a family uprooted and a community fractured. For UNRWA staff, the war's end brought no relief. It brought a new emergency and the haunting task of recording names, losses, and shattered lives. In New York, diplomats crowded the United Nations chamber as Resolution 242 was drafted, its language fiercely debated. On November the 22nd, 1967, the Security Council adopted the measure, calling for Israeli withdrawal from occupied territories and for a just solution for refugees. 2 months earlier, Arab leaders had met in Khartoum and issued the 3 no's: no peace, no recognition, no negotiations with Israel. These words and documents hardened the new map, shaping every ceasefire line and every negotiation for decades to come. Borders may shift, but their consequences endure. The lines drawn in 1967 still define millions of lives and fuel today's Middle East tensions. Every negotiation, ceasefire, and conflict traces back to these 6 days. History doesn't rest. It shapes tomorrow. What does that mean for peace now?